with copyrights. If you write the program yourself, if you didn't copy, then you are not infringing any copyrights. Nobody else has a copyright on the code that you wrote. But there might be patents, and in fact there surely are patents prohibiting the code that you wrote, unless your program is very small. Large programs combine thousands of different ideas. That's the work of developing software, combining lots of different ideas. Well, if a country is foolish enough to allow those ideas to be patented, the result is that anyone who develops a large program has surely infringed hundreds of patents. He can't know which ones they are, it's too much work to find out, but he could be sure that there must be hundreds of them. So, software patents are like landmines for software development. With each design decision, chances are nothing happens. Chances are this step doesn't step on a patent, and chances are this step doesn't step on a patent, and chances are this step doesn't step on a patent. But to cross the whole minefield, to develop the whole program, I've got to take thousands of steps. And surely sometimes I'm going to step on a patent which could explode and destroy the project. But this analogy is not perfect. Once somebody steps on a landmine, it's not dangerous anymore. So, software patents started in the U.S. And the U.S. government has been trying very hard to pressure other governments to adopt the same policy. That's because the U.S. government is essentially the puppet of the multinational corporations. And it's the multinational corporations, the mega corporations, that expect to benefit from software patents, because they own a lot of patents and they cross-license each other, so they are mostly safe and everyone else gets all the danger. So the European Commission several years ago wrote a directive which was carefully written so that it didn't appear to authorize software patents, but it really did. They published this directive as a Word file. Really stupid thing to do, publishing anything as a Word file. You should never do that. Because they published it as a Word file, people could tell that most of the editing was done by a lawyer for the Business Software Association. So, then it was the European Parliament's turn to consider this. And the European Parliament voted to amend the directive not to allow software patents. The European Parliament adopted dozens of amendments, correcting various different loopholes that could have allowed software patents. So the European Parliament conclusively rejected software patents. But the European Parliament does not have much power. The system is designed so that the European Parliament plays a part, but it doesn't have much influence over the ultimate outcome. In other words, the European Union is a sham democracy. It looks like democracy, but the people don't really have much power. The European Union is a system where bureaucrats can make decisions that the people cannot change. If you want to preserve democracy, do not enter the European Union. I am all in favor of the idea of a democratic union of Europe. I think this would be a great thing if we had one. So, the European Parliament did this, and then the directive went to the Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers proposed to reject everything the Parliament had done and labeled that an uncontroversial item which didn't require debate. And that went through last May, I think. But that required ratification in another meeting. And we convinced some countries to change their votes. And in other countries, Parliament voted to change the vote. For instance, the Dutch Parliament voted to direct its government to oppose software patents. And the government disobeyed Parliament. The government's representatives supported software patents in the Council of Ministers, even though the Parliament that supposedly is in charge of their country's policy said not to do so. The German Parliament voted unanimously to oppose software patents. The German minister in the Council of Ministers supported them. What we have here is essentially mass illegality. This decision to reject the Parliament's vote, the European Parliament's vote, and authorize software patents was approved in March. So now the European Parliament gets to vote on it one more time in July. However, to reject or change the directive on the second reading requires more than half the members of the European Parliament to vote to do so. In other words, not just a majority of those voting, but a majority of the entire Parliament. And it's going to be hard to convince enough members of Parliament to be present, because generally a lot of them don't show up. So we at this point are fighting this last battle where we might lose completely or we might not. There's a strong sentiment in the European Parliament for sustaining its previous decision, and important parties like, I believe, the Socialists and the Conservatives are in favor of doing so. So maybe we'll win this battle. If we win this battle, it's not final. If we lose it, it's final. So that's another reason why you shouldn't join the European Union. Are there more questions?
You have said before that certain information works such as dictionaries, textbooks and so on should be free. do you believe that the law should enforce that? That is, the law should say if I make a dictionary, it should be free? Or do you think that free works will prevail over non-free works over time, just as free software is likely to prevail over non-free software?
I don't know. And I would be happy in a world where we were using free dictionaries and encyclopedias, whether it was legally required or not.
And if I may have a follow-up, why do you think it's that free software has taken off, so to speak, so quickly, whereas free dictionaries and encyclopedias have taken so long? After all, we are...
I think you're mistaken. It's just the opposite. Remember, we started developing the GNU operating system at the beginning of 1984. But it took almost a decade before we had a system that could run and that was starting to take off. And it still hasn't become the software used by most people. The progress on the free encyclopedia was much faster. It took just a few years to make it superior. And the dictionary projects are now starting. So, as I see it, things are going faster in these newer areas.
Michael Stefan, Free Newspaper. My question is that if we don't win the battle, with the European Union, this would be our last battle. What do you mean?
If the European Parliament does not vote against software patents in July, the directive will be final. So that will be the last battle about, that will be final defeat about software patents in the European Union.
My name is Cameron. I'd like to ask you, how can a country like United States, which is known as a country where people value their freedom, elect corrupted governments? This is my first question. My second is, how I'm a software developer, so I'd like to ask you how we are supposed to be awarded for our work.
Well, first of all, how did the U.S. democracy get so sick? It's because business money started to get a lot more and more influence in political decisions. And then the final attack on our freedom involved using the September 11th attacks as an excuse. So they took away our freedom in the name of protecting us. Bush, who stole the election both times, and this has been documented thoroughly. The first time Bush stole the election, Greg Palast worked out how. And he published this in a major London newspaper. But the newspapers in the U.S. did not pick up the story. They didn't seem to want people in the U.S. to be aware that their election had been stolen. The media in the U.S. are fairly controlled. Not by an explicit system of censorship, of course. Instead, they're controlled because they're part of large business empires. And these business empires know their interests. They tell the government what to do, and they also decide what to publish. So people who run the minor media, like me on my website, we're free to to present this information about how the election was stolen, but most people never see that. And the mass media are controlled by the businesses that they work for. The effective result is that if the candidate's business prefers do something extremely wrong, it gets hushed up, mostly. Some people will still talk about it, but it doesn't show up in the mass media. And anyone who tries to talk about it gets attacked. Meanwhile, the candidates that business don't like, if they have any slight flaw, it gets exaggerated and talked about constantly, making us even a small thing or even a small doubt seem very large. Polls show that of the supporters of Bush, and millions of people do support him even though they weren't the majority, that most of them still believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and they still believe that he was working with Al-Qaeda. Both of these have been established as false. But Bush never admits a mistake. So once these things were established as false, he would just talk about Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda nearby each other in every speech. And this was enough to keep his supporters believing a falsehood. So the media in the US do not effectively correct such falsehoods, even when they're proved to be false.
Mr. Stolman, can I...
Now, that was one question. Now, of course, I'm not the expert on this. Chomsky explains much better. I recommend reading Chomsky. The second thing is, how should programmers make a living? Well, that's not how he said it. How should they be paid for their work? Which is a silly question, because are you trying to say that programmers are not allowed to volunteer to do anything? You're trying to say they have to be paid for their work. They're not allowed to volunteer. Well, that'll be news to the million or so free software developer volunteers, that they're not supposed to do it. But, in fact, it's a completely silly question, because most programmers that are getting paid to program are working on private use software. Only a small fraction are working on software meant to be distributed at all. So, if we replace all the proprietary distributed software with free software, this will have no effect on the majority of programmers. They'll still be paid to develop software for use by a single client, just as they are now.
Mr. Stolman, can I suggest that we leave? It is 11:45.
My flight is at 2:45, so I don't think we're in a terrible hurry, but... Yeah, but we need time for you to collect stickers and perhaps buy some pins and key rings. By the way, if you want more information about free software, take a look at www.gnu.org. There is a free software foundation in Europe now called FSF Europe. If you look at fsfeurope.org, you can get more information about it. And that's all, folks.
Long question. I got microfoon, Special.